Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Cassidy Diamond, and I am the Public Programs and Events Manager here at the International Documentary Association. We're so glad to have you here for this conversation with Stray, with our moderator, Claudia Puig, the president of the Los Angeles Film Critics Association. So excited to get this started. But before we do, I'd like to start with a brief land acknowledgement. I come to you today from Chicago on the unceded lands of the three fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. I would also like to thank our media sponsor, IndieWire, for helping bring the screening series to us today, along with support from KCRW. And we have many more amazing conversations and films coming up all the way through to the end of January. So to find out more, go to documentary.org/screening series. And without further ado, I'm going to bring on the president of Los Angeles Film Critics Association, Claudia Puig, to get our conversation started. Hi, Claudia.
Thanks so much. Hi, Cassidy. Thank you so much. I'm so excited for this conversation because I love this film. And Elizabeth Lo is an award-winning filmmaker, and she was named one of the 25 new faces of independent film by Filmmaker magazine. Her work has been showcased all over the world. Elizabeth, welcome and congrats on a wonderful film.
Hi, Claudia. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming to us all the way from Hong Kong too, because it's early in the morning there. So I have to tell you just personally, I have two rescue dogs, and I adore, and I've always had rescue dogs, and I adore this love letter to dogs. And I also love how complex and multidimensional this is as a look at humanity and how it relates to stray animals and refugees and the unhoused and all of that. So thank you for this beautiful observational film.
Thank you for reading it into it that way. And I'm so glad that it resonated with you.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with how you got involved with this and what was the impetus for making this film?
Yeah, it came from a really personal place. Like you, I also had a dog growing up, and it was when he died, I remember being so struck by the grief of that, and then feeling like eventually I wanted to use the tools that I've learned, which is filmmaking, to try to express sort of the dignity of lives that are often not afforded the kind of narrative time and space we afford many other people's and beings' stories. And a stray dog felt like the right sort of vessel for that story to sort of express and assert the value of every being in a way. Especially with stray dogs, they exist on the peripheries of society, they're owned by no one. And in a way, they're the most vulnerable sort of populations that can exist in an urban framework. And so when I was researching about stray dogs and where in the world they're incorporated into a city or where there's interesting history, Turkey came up as one of those places. And when I scouted it back in 2017, it was just so remarkable to see a society that had somehow integrated dogs to be a part of their framework, to not be owned and still roam freely, and to learn about that history that's not in the film, which is, I feel very much like it's based on Wes Anderson's Isle of Dogs, the premise.
Oh, yes.
Where dogs were exiled, because that happened in the 1900s in Istanbul, where dogs were exiled at one point, forced by like the British government, strangely. And the people really felt like the exiling of the dogs was a curse on the city, because shortly afterwards, all these huge fires broke out, and then World War I happened. And so over time, over the last century, the Turkish people have fought for the right of dogs to exist on the streets, despite the government's efforts in the past to eradicate them. So to me, these dogs felt very much like a testament to human mercy and tolerance. And their existence today there is kind of a miracle to me, even though we think of stray dogs as really common, beings.
No, that is a miracle, and how wonderful to explore human mercy and compassion like that, because we need so much more of it in the world. So that's
Yeah,
um, I want to ask you about Zayton and how you found him. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
yeah,
Okay,
correct.
because he's such an expressive dog. Or she? Is it a she?
She's a
Yeah,
she.
she's such an expressive dog, and I understand her name means olive, but like
Yeah.
also like deeply expressive olive eyes. Or
Yeah.
um, tell us a little bit about how you found her and connected with her.
Yeah, so in 2018, when we went back to Turkey to accomplish the bulk of the shoot, we kind of had no schedule going in. We had no pre-producing plans in a way, and it was me and Zeynep Koprulu, who is a co-producer on the film. She's based in Istanbul, and we kind of just wandered around the city and tried to see what caught our eye. And one day we were in an underground tunnel, really busy underground tunnel full of people. And there were these two dogs, Zayton and Nazar, her companion. They were streaking through the people. And I was like, where are these dogs going? You know, stray dogs don't usually have a schedule, you know, to follow or appointments to make. And so we followed them. And it turned out they were on the heels of the young Syrian men who eventually make their way into the film. And the relationship that I saw between them, sort of the warmth and the feeling of like that they had formed a pack, a tribe on the streets as they were living without security or status. The sense of dignity and warmth that they gave to each other was really moving to me. And I deeply felt like these boys, they had such a desire to acquire dogs and puppies and take care of other beings, even in their state of not having much in life, because it gave them a sense of security and meaning and purpose on a very visceral level. And I imagine it must be similar for Zayton and Nazar.
Yeah, that's always so interesting to me, because I think most of us think of dogs as, we have like one or two at home, and you don't think of them as pack animals. But whenever I've gone to a city or a part of the world where I remember in Mexico seeing like groups of dogs, and in Chile seeing groups of dogs, and they bond together and they live in like little, it seems like small societies. And what did you learn about like that, sort of the anthropology of dogs as you were making the film?
Yeah, something that also really drew me to Zayton specifically is that while she had these bonds that felt a little itinerant and temporary with the young men, and then also with Nazar and the other dogs, she was also very radically independent. Like she didn't always follow the boys. Like she would go off on her own, and I would notice that she would be friends with particular dogs within the neighborhoods that she was in, where it was clear that those dogs knew her and she knew them, and they would interact and have fun. But then she would sometimes also wander into territory that was unfamiliar, where she was unwelcome, where there's a scene in the film where she gets attacked by some dogs against some stores. And it's interesting because dogs are they're not totally like pack animals the way that wolves are. Like there is very much this sense that she's a solitary being in a way, a little bit adrift, not her networks are not always secure. But I also felt like that was really compelling to me. Um, you know, the parallels that exist with our lives and people who exist on the margins. Hers is,
Yeah.
she's not firmly in a community, and yet this is very much her home, that she's made it her home, the city. She knows the streets.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
but she's
and
kind of left to her own devices.
I want to ask you about that aspect of following her in the streets. But before I do, I have to tell you how affected I was by the Syrian refugee boys too, because that was, in a sense, they're strays, and the fact that they're oftentimes treated worse than the dogs are. At least people stop and pat the dogs on the head, and these boys don't, get that kind of care. How was your interaction with them? Were you able to communicate with them, and how'd that work out?
So the young men, they're from Syria, but they're Turkmen, so they speak Turkish.
Okay.
And so my co-producers, Zeynep or Ceylan, they were able to communicate with them. I wasn't able to, but I felt like because we both had this shared passion for the dogs, that instantly there was this trust there. I trusted them. And I think there were times when, people in the city would try to warn me about the boys, like, oh, they're dangerous, because there was this impression that, they're these young men on the streets. Um, but I think because I had spent so much time with them, obviously I trusted them. And And they also trusted the respect that I had for them and the respect that I had for their dogs, or what they felt like were their dogs. Yeah, so that was kind of the relationship.
So, and you filmed this over the course of 2 years, did I understand?
It was from 2017 to 2019. So I guess over a 3-year period, but
Wow.
around 6 months of actual production.
So have you found out anything more, or kind of stayed in touch and found out how the boys are doing, how the dogs are doing?
Yeah, Zeynep Kopulu, our co-producer who lives in Istanbul, very recently, like a week ago, she sent me a photograph of encountering Zeytin sleeping on the streets with one of the boys under a blanket, and very much in the way that it appears in the film. So their lives, despite the pandemic, they've been able to survive. And I've learned also that Turkish citizens and the government have, I mean, there's a lot of infrastructure that's lacking for refugees, but at least in terms of the stray animal population, people still kept up the feeding of the animals, even though people were no longer going to cafes and outdoors restaurants.
That's good to hear. Yeah. Have you shown the film in Turkey?
No, but it is playing at the Istanbul Independent Film Festival in person, which we're really, hopefully, which we're really excited about. And it's
When
probably
is that?
unrealistic that I'll be able, it's in February. Our team has this fantasy that we'll be able to go there because we would love to be able to like find the young men and also Zeytin and Nazar and bring them to a live screening. That would be incredible, but we're not sure.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard to know what's going to happen in February, but maybe if that vaccine kicks in quickly, it will be
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah, one can hope.
Yes, definitely we can hope. Well, yeah, the way things are going, there's a little cause for hope. Thanks to you and your camera, we come to know these dogs, and I guess the idea of Zeytin and Nazar. How did you know that they would be your guides through this? And did you have a sudden sense, this is the dog I want to follow? These are the dogs. How did you make that call?
Yeah, I think it was, so one of the problems, and maybe this is like a classical documentary conundrum, the relationship between the filmmaker and the participant or the subject and how we can influence each other. And with the dogs, a lot of times we would follow different stray dogs as we were in the casting process, and they would become attached to us and they would end up following us around, which kind of defeated the premise of the film, which is to see, where does a non-human gaze take you when you move away from the centers of power, from an anthropocentric understanding of the world, and you truly try to immerse yourself in what a dog might be interested in a city. Where does that take you? And Zeytin was actually one of the very few dogs, she actually was one of the only ones who always remained almost stubbornly independent and wouldn't allow us to orchestrate anything, we'd try to bribe her with treats sometimes to wake her up if she wasn't doing stuff. But very quickly we realized like she was such a stubborn dog, and our camera would be able to get so close to her and she would just be able to look straight past me. And that quality was a rare quality. Like, she was not self-conscious in front of the camera at all, in the way that humans differ in their level of self-consciousness. She was one of those who could just stand in front of my camera calmly and I could move all around her and she wouldn't be bothered. And of course, her face is wrinkled and full of depth.
So beautiful, yes. So, okay, how just logistically, your camera was so low to the ground, it was on a dog's eye level. How did you accomplish that?
Yeah, I mean, before going out, we obviously had to figure out like, how do we cinematically represent dogs' vision or movement? And we considered GoPros, and we did try to strap on GoPros to dogs, but we realized like that was just too nauseous and kind of prohibitive of the audience empathizing with the central protagonist, which is what was my goal as a filmmaker, to get over our species hump, sort of in terms of our prejudices or not giving other species the benefit of the doubt of the richness of their inner lives. And so we figured out, we got grants from both Rooftop Films and Alexa Amira. They had a grant. So we had both the C300 and the Alexa Amira. And the Alexa Amira was really important because that film's usually used on fictional sets. And we really wanted the kind of beauty and gravity that kind of camera is associated with, you know, like a long shot of the back of an actress's head. You're pulled in, you're assuming what they're you know, what that, imagining the inner life of that actress. And we wanted to afford that to Zeytin and Nazar also. And then in terms of logistically, I had an easy rig hanging to support the weight of the camera and a gimbal to stabilize the camera. And I kind of just crouched really low all the time. And over time, over the 6 months of filming, at first it was really frustrating because the dogs would just dart off, you know, to unheard sounds by me and unknown smells. And they would run, and it was really frustrating. But I think over time, I kind of started to understand what ticked them off, and or just be able to understand their language a bit better, or also to just relinquish control and understand, look, I'm not going to be able to catch up with those dogs where they're going. No, that was my approach.
I love that you kind of got into the mindset, the nose, the ears of a dog. That's amazing. That's so cool.
Yeah.
And I love what you said about our anthropomorphic take on the world, and, you know, trying to see things, because I think everybody who's had a dog, you know, tries to figure out, what are they thinking? What, you know, are they really, do they feel this emotion? You know, you ask yourself so many questions. And you know, the idea of letting that go, I guess, and the way in which you did, and just kind of letting them dictate.
Yeah.
That must be hard for a filmmaker, because one of the jobs of a filmmaker is to be in control, right? Or to be sort of.
Yeah. I mean, like, one of the impetuses of making this film, I mean, I firmly believe in animal rights being the next social justice frontier that we have to tackle as a species, and anthropocentrism, you know, giving more weight to human perspectives is a really toxic and dominant narrative in the world that has, you know, unleashed untold destruction around the planet and is hurting ourselves in the end. And so embedding in their worldview, and as a filmmaker, it was a challenge, because this is a film that's made for people to consume and to watch. And so this balance between, like, how much can an audience member take of just staring at a dog and being interested in what a dog is interested in, which oftentimes is not necessarily what we're drawn to, like, you know, the couples who are arguing over Instagram, the overheard conversations, or the political landscape, you know, those I felt like almost were like treats for human audiences,
right?
Like,
our little milk bones.
Okay, here's some human drama that you might be more invested in, but always the integrity of the film was that, okay, you get tidbits of that, but over time, like, after all, the dogs, they care, but they also don't care. So they're very much a grounding perspective of all the dramas and all the things that we're going through. At the end of the day, the dogs, they ground us, and I let the film say what it wants to say about that.
And you so wisely, I think the length of the film is perfect. 72 minutes, that's short for most films. And yet it's, like you talk about, you know, there's, I think, the ability of audiences were so trained to look for action, or for, you know, peaks and things like that. How did you arrive at that particular length? Because I'm sure you had loads of footage. How did you decide that was going to be the cut?
I think, yeah, people have told me that the length feels perfect, and I feel that very gratified by that, because one of the goals in me setting out to make this film, and I think it is kind of bold to try to say, hey, I'm going to make a film that centers on just one stray dog and their life, you know, and not necessarily that much goes on. It's not a strictly linear story. But for me, it felt like I had made a lot of short films that were very tight. And I wanted, as a filmmaker and as an artist, to allow myself more room to breathe. And even though 72 minutes is short for a feature, for me, it was a big challenge to kind of expand into that space and to allow myself that space and to take up that kind of time from an audience. But I also felt like it was really important that this wasn't just a short film, and in a pre-COVID time, I had imagined that this was going to be a film where, you know, a dog like Zeytin's face was going to be filling the screen on, like, you know, a 15-foot screen, and that she was worthy of that our lens and our gaze and our time, she's worth it. And that was really important to me. And in terms of, like, the ebb and flow of the structure, I've thought about this, like it was a real challenge balancing the dog POV and then the human interest. But over time, after a while, I kind of just shut myself in and just edited and got to a finished cut and really didn't show anyone and kind of operated on instinct. But I feel like it worked because dogs and humans evolved together and our stories have always been intertwined. We've always been interested in them and they've always been interested in us. So I feel like there's something about that sort of evolutionarily biological relationship that is reflected in the way the film kind of edits together. That's at least what I thought about how it all came together, because it all is kind of like a sort of a subconscious kind of process.
Well, and since the film was inspired by, the loss of your dog and wanting to look at that anthropocentric, I can't say it well, look at the world, how did you kind of decide on how to work in the refugee boys? Because that's, it could have been just about the dogs. How did you make that call?
Yeah. Yeah, balancing how much we're there in the film and how much we get to know them was difficult because at the same time, the film is not about their lives, but I see a lot of parallels in these kinds of existences, the precarity of these existences on the peripheries of society. And and to me, it just felt natural. And also because I think a film about dogs almost necessarily has to include the human because we're so much a part of their DNA and they us. But at the same time, I also didn't want the human relationship to overtake that story because of the non-human, recentering the world of this film in a non-human gaze. So I felt like the relationship, came down to the casting. Like Zeytin's relationship with these boys was very much how it's portrayed in the film. It ebbs and flows. They reunite occasionally, and then she wanders off on her own, and so it felt very much natural to the film. But it also was telling this story that I felt is the kinds of people and beings that I want to focus my lens on and empower through the lens.
As a kind, humane person like you are and a dog lover, was it hard not to intervene? Like when you see that Zeytin gets into the fight with those other dogs, how
Yeah.
did you deal with that?
As a filmmaker, I don't believe in non-intervention. Like I think that's a colonial way to approach being the privilege of being able to wield a camera and be in the real world. I think of myself as a citizen, as a person first before a filmmaker. And I think all those things should be synonymous. And there were times when I intervened. And with the scene where Zeytin gets attacked by the other dogs, I knew that she was okay. Like quickly the dogs left. There are moments that are not in the film where, Nazar, not Zeytin, like actually got hold of a cat. And I felt very much compelled to intervene and save that cat, at the risk of losing this, potentially dramatic footage. But to me, anyone in that city would have intervened. And so I felt if I was witnessing this, I had to intervene it too. And I feel that that's my responsibility as a person, and to think that one's art trumps your moral obligations as a person.
Yes.
To me is hubris, which is antithetical to what I think the message of the film is.
Absolutely. We're humans first. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What made you decide on the wordlessness of it? Because that's a really interesting technique. I mean, one of the things that when I've watched documentaries that center on animals, like say those Disney ones, it drives me crazy how they anthropomorphize some and the thoughts that are going on in like the monkey's head or whatever, or they have the constant narration. But there's others that have like some intermittent narration. How did you decide on the particular approach that you took?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you noticed the wordlessness of the film, and I share your frustration with other sort of Disneyfied films of animals, because I always am so disappointed by animal films that claim to be about the animals, but it's really just a complete human projection. Yeah. and I guess in terms of textlessness, I guess I think humans, I think all animals share languages and have them, but the type of language that we have that's highly verbal, I think it's important if the mission of the film is to look beyond your own culture, nationality, class, and finally species, to adopt languages that go beyond the verbal. And for dogs, it obviously isn't, they may know many words, but their existences are sounds and cityscapes and higher pitched noises. And it's not the words that we're used to. And I always knew that like we would never use narration, or we would never use like a voiceover to try to captivate audiences, because that just felt so against the grain of what the film was trying to envelop you in, which is take you out of your what you're familiar with and put you in audio and visual space that might even just attempt to put you in a different mindset, and to understand the world in a slightly defamiliarized way. And cinema feels so much like a space to do that, because it's a medium that exists beyond words.
Yes.
And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that aspect of it. That was, how challenging was it to film in a country? I know you had the producer who was from Istanbul, but how hard was it for you as a person doesn't speak the language and it's an unfamiliar culture to spend that much time filming there?
Yeah, filming in Turkey was actually the first time that I was filming abroad from a society that I knew well. Most of my films have taken place in the US, and it was such a privilege to be able to go there as a complete outsider, and visually to be an outsider as well, because I think people would assume that I didn't understand what they were saying, which is true. But I feel like that actually helped me to get closer to my subjects, the dogs, because I felt myself, as I was like crouched low, living life according to their stray dog schedule, following them around, that I was slowly learning to read human bodies and emotions and micro expressions in the same way that I think dogs do, in order to understand what's being said to them and what the boundaries of those people around me are. How close can I get to them with my camera or my microphone? And also, I think the dogs as my film's subject also kind of lowered people's guards around me as well. And it felt very much like this. That's why this film is the film that I wanted to make, because these dogs are, in a way, it's very much about the dogs, but they're also this vehicle. They're these vehicles that are innocuous, and they can, at least in Turkey, in Istanbul, they traverse different classes of people, different genders of people, different ethnicities of people, and they're accepted in many places. And I felt like the dogs kind of gave that passport to me, in a way, that license. Just because I was connected with them, people afforded me the same.
That's fascinating. And that you're picking up on the cues. You're really much more immersed in their view of life.
Yeah. Because I didn't understand what was being said around me.
Right. It was interesting. I was always sort of drawn to, like, how are people going to relate? Is this person going to stop and pet this dog? Or is this person going to walk past them? You start as a viewer, you're trying to predict, oh, this person will do this. And you're invariably wrong, which is what makes it interesting. Being crouched down like that, I mean, physically, what did that do to you? I would think you'd be aching at the end of a day.
Yeah, definitely. There were times that I feel like there's this, there are moments that I remember it would be waking up early with the rig on, and it would be really cold, and I'd turn to Zeynep Aslanova, another co-producer who was in the film with me. Like I'd turn to her and be like, well, what are we doing with our lives? Like chasing these dogs around. And like, I hope this is worth it. It definitely was relatively backbreaking, but at the same time, like I felt like it was really important for the film to visually be at a different height than we're used to seeing the world, because I think on a visceral level and also on a almost philosophical level, the visual mode of the film is literally challenging you to see the world in an unconventional way, which is the purpose of the film.
And I think it makes so much more sense to have you be the person sort of guiding that. I did see a movie at Sundance, Truffle Hunters. Have you heard about this? Where they put a cam on the dogs, the truffle snorkeling dogs, and it's for like one scene, and they're running into, it is extremely jarring. But that's the point in that particular scene, and it's not an entire film made that way. But
Yeah, there's actually one scene in Stray that's also from the GoPro. It's when they're stealing the puppy Cartal.
oh
That's shot on a
yes,
GoPro, and that's because I didn't realize they were stealing because I don't understand their language. But I didn't realize the boys were planning to steal the dog from the construction site from the security workers. And had I known, I don't know, maybe I would have intervened. But because I didn't know, and we happened to be recording on the GoPro of Zayton's back, and so she captured that action.
oh wow. So yeah, that's the thing. I think a scene or two like that makes sense, but an entire movie would be hard. I think for
Yeah.
people who complain about shaky cams. I mean, that would be the
Well, I would be
ultimate.
fascinated too, like what unmonitored dogs do get up to.
So you've shown this film. I know it's playing hot dogs, and you've shown it kind of around. What has been the reaction that you've gotten from people who've seen it?
I've been so pleased and gratified that, like, one of the challenges as I was editing the film was like, are people going to care? It's not a conventional documentary structure. The subject matter is not conventional. And would people really be able to relate to this dog or even care about this dog? And people do, and it like resonates with people, and people read so much into Zayton, her eyes. They see her as like such a soulful being, and so I feel so gratified that audiences are getting what I kind of set out to do, and even beyond what I expected. And so it's been really nice, even though all of these reactions are just virtual, because I have yet to see the film with a live audience.
Oh,
Yeah.
but you will
Oh yeah,
at some point.
2021.
Yeah. I love that, the observational aspect of it, because, we're talking about those Disney things. I mean, those are the ultimate manipulation, but there is more subtle ways to manipulate as well that you could have done, but you didn't. And I mean, I guess editing ultimately does a little of that, but not really. And you just, the fly on the wall technique, I think, is such a, or fly on the back of a dog technique.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Were you ever having to sort of restrain yourself from, or was that something that just came naturally?
No, it came naturally. Like a lot of my short films in the past have been observational, and I don't know why. It's just a mode that I feel very drawn to and feel at ease in, and it felt like it fit this story. Yeah, just being there with the dogs and letting the dogs on camera kind of speak for themselves.
What was the most challenging aspect when you were in the midst of those couple of years and then the 6 months of shooting?
Um, I would say like shooting was a joy. Like when I think back to it, it's one of the best times of my life, hanging out with dogs all day and feeling like you're collecting this footage that for me feels like a time capsule, because like you don't know the status of these dogs. They can change overnight if the government turns against them or if the will of the people turns against them. And 10 years from now, 20 years from now, as Istanbul develops. So for me, it felt so valuable and gratifying to have the privilege of capturing this footage of a time of the city. But the most challenging parts, I think, was getting other people, as I was making the film, to believe in the film too, because I think it's an unconventional story. It's an unconventional premise that I feel is very timeless, but it's not necessarily like a timely sort of hard-hitting piece. Although I think the portrait that emerges out of Istanbul from 2017 to 2019 is very much a lot of global issues, the influx of refugees, and
Yes.
all of that is so relevant. But it was hard to get people to understand what the vision of that film was, because it's hard to put into words, I think, something like this film. And so that was one of the biggest challenges, and always having to still believe in the film, even if other people had doubts about it. And it's been so gratifying to see audiences and critics really respond to the film and read into it in all the ways that I could only hope people would.
I noticed you had 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, which
Really?
yeah,
Oh,
you do.
wow.
I know, that's great.
Cool. Thanks for
Happy to
letting me
spread good
know.
news. Yeah. One of the things that I love is how it captures the inherent dignity of dogs. And I have a three-legged dog, and so people are constantly commenting, "Oh, look, he gets along pretty well with his three legs." And I'm always like, "Yeah, and they've so much that they could teach us. If I were to lose a limb, I would be whining about it endlessly. But the fact that this dog just adapts and is perfectly content, there's so much we can learn from them. And I feel like that's also a part of of what we're watching, just continuing on and the resilience of animals.
Completely. And that's actually why the inner titles of Diogenes, that Greek philosopher who was born
Yes.
in the land of modern day Turkey now, his
Oh,
philosophy was built around the idea that, look to dogs for virtue, look to dogs for how to live, detached from property and wealth and all the things that we concern ourselves with. Um, that's how to become like a proper human being is what he says.
human
And
beings
that the
live
film is really,
artificially and
yeah.
hypocritically and would do well to study the dog. I love
Yeah,
that.
and the
Yeah,
film is a study of dogs to see how almost how we should live or how we might,
exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
or how the most vulnerable members of a society are treated or embraced.
It's fun. I think about this a lot because we have coyotes where I live, and people are constantly, railing about coyotes, and I'm always like, well, we've encroached on their territory, and they're just trying to live, and I just see them as dogs. They're just, they're wild dogs, and yes,
Yeah.
you have to be careful that they don't take your cat or they're your tiny dog, but um, it's very interesting to sort of watch uh, the reaction people have. Like, what's the distinction between a stray dog and your little pet and a coyote? They're all trying to live.
Completely. It's arbitrary, the
Yeah.
value that we assign to different beings based on how they fit into our worlds. And that was very much what the film was trying to question, how arbitrary these kinds of notions are.
What did you come away with ultimately about in your look at Turkey? Because that's a country that's obviously in the midst of some upheaval.
Yeah. I think I won't comment on sort of like the political the, the political moment that the country is caught in, and because I feel like what I came away with was, regardless of what governments are in power or what the fissures in society are at that point, what was really informative to me was the civilization that valued stray animals in this way, that treated um, interspecies life and valued it in this way that's so different than the cultures that I'm familiar with, which is being Chinese and also being American. I don't think we have respect for nature or for the will of other animals. Whereas in Turkey, you know, government officials, when they take the dogs to vaccinate them, but legally, and whether they do this or not, sometimes they don't, but legally they have to return them to the place where they found that dog. And that is such a profound respect for the agency and property status of a dog, that they can claim territory as much as humans can. And that's something that I really hope the film also shows people. Because going into this, my assumption when I wanted to make a film about stray dogs was, and people always react, oh, is it a really sad film? Like, oh, stray dogs, that's such a pity. But from making this film, I realized we've conceived of our relationships to dogs as one of purely pet ownership and ownership. Um, but there's other ways for other beings to exist that exist outside of our capitalist model of relating to
Yes.
other species.
Our
And that,
colonialist model. Yeah.
exactly, and it can be
Yeah.
really beautiful. And that what we think is inhumane, like I think we tend to think, oh, cities that have lots of stray dogs are not taking care of their dogs. But it really, when I went to Turkey and told people, oh, back where I'm from, they kill millions of dogs if they don't find owners, they were appalled. And so it's really flipping on your head. And I want the film to be this decolonizing tool. Like all your assumptions about what's right and wrong, it can be flipped around, and there are some relationships that are better, that are just more humane and more productive for everyone involved in those relationships. And to ask audiences to shift or challenge what they assume to be true about stray dogs, or all the, what's the right way to coexist with other animals. To be open enough and humble enough to realize, oh, maybe my culture or how my culture developed got it wrong in terms of how to integrate
That
others.
is fascinating. And I guess you could take that the next step to, so many of our cities have problems with unhoused people, and,
Yeah.
it could be taken to, there's a lot of pondering that it makes me want to go back and watch your film again and look at it specifically through that lens, because I think there's so much to unpack there. And we
Yeah.
do tend to we come from a perspective, and we tend to, it's great to have a film in which you can set that aside and look at things
Yeah.
differently, truly
Yeah.
open your mind.
Completely. And I think I may be overstepping here, but I do feel like at the time that I was filming, the relationship that Turkish people had towards refugees and Syrians coming in and using Turkey as a haven, as a refuge, even if there wasn't infrastructure there for them to support them, they were at least being allowed to live there in a way that they, weren't in Western Europe or have been excluded. And I do see, like, even in the way that the security guards talk to the boys, or even the pedestrians that try to offer, unhelpful advice to the boys, like, go back to, get your education when you go back there, like, even if it's, it's well-intentioned, and even if it doesn't come off well, like, there is still some warmth there. And at the time that I was filming, politicians wouldn't run on campaigns that villainized or demonized refugees, because they didn't know how that would play to the right or the left. So I thought that was also very interesting. That it's so different than Western Europe or America.
Right.
And things, I think, may have changed because of context and how borders and the amount of refugees that are coming in, and also the economy affecting people's sentiments. But at the time that I was there, I found that very remarkable.
It is
that there
remarkable.
was this tolerance.
Yeah.
That couldn't be fully politicized, even if now, things have changed, which
Sure.
is also speaks to one of the film's messages, which is, the precarity of the status of a being and how arbitrary that is and how it can change overnight.
Well, that is a beautiful note to wrap up on. And this has been such a fascinating conversation. Elizabeth, thank you so much. Thank you for your wonderful film. And thank you for taking the time to talk with us too. And I guess my very last question, I would throw one last one in here, is what do you want people to take away after seeing your film?
I think I want people to take away whatever whatever strikes them. But one of the things, I don't want to seem too didactic, but I'm like, one of the things is I want, to acknowledge the richness of every single being's life, like, no matter how insignificant and common seeming. If you focus your camera, or you take the time to look and spend time with a being, you'll find that they have such rich lives, and, they shouldn't be discounted. And then another one is to question, like, what could our cities look like that aren't devoid of all other life forms? Or, and you can extend that, of course, to ethnicities, citizenships, nationalities. But I want the film to be a celebration of tolerance and compassion and diversity in a very specific sense.
Yeah, that's fantastic. There's probably nothing more than that you could strive for. So that's lovely. Thank you again so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Claudia. And thank you also, Gabe.
Yes, thank you, Gabe.